Good morning. It's Monday, April 18th, 2022. 3 days off, and I forget how to pronounce it already. Welcome to Triggered. I'm Cory Morgan. I hope everybody had a good Easter weekend. Those who are into the observances or just enjoying an extra day off. It was much needed for a lot of us. A lot of people were off still today. The traffic was down coming into downtown Calgary, but I'm afraid at the Standard, we took the Friday rather than the Monday. It's one of those weird holidays. I got a hard act to follow today. First thing this morning, for those who didn't catch it, we had Danielle Smith on. She kicked off her show. She's going to be doing that every day here live at 9 a.m. Well, not every day. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays at 9 a.m. And then Saturday, she does an extended show for an hour and a half with a guest. So kind of a deep dive into issues and discussion with them. And yes, that reminder is live. It's great to see everybody coming in and seeing where you're coming from, where you're at. To see Gary Parkin from Lemberg, Saskatchewan. One of our guests today is going to be Chris Oldcorn. He's the Western Standard Saskatchewan Bureau Chief. We're going to talk about some of those issues from our neighbor just to the east of us there. As well, I'm going to have Mark Milke. He's an author. He was involved with Fraser Institute and a number of other institutes, and he also put a column in the Western Standard recently. And we're going to talk about equity versus equality. You know, words that sound so similar, yet they have some very serious different meanings to them, depending on the interpretation of them. Some folks who we got from Medicine Hat, lots of local people, Linden, Alberta. Good to see you all in there. So the comments, just that reminder too. I like the comments. I like seeing them go. Discuss things with each other. Discuss things with me. Send questions for the guests. I do read them all. I don't necessarily read them out. I try to get to what I can. And like I said, just try to stay civil with each other, though. We want to be nice. We don't have to always agree. But we do want to keep it, that's what's nice about being live. I want to keep that interaction going so we aren't blocking people for getting too rude with each other. Most of you aren't. It's great. So let's see what I'm going to rant about today. And yes, I brought up speaking of triggered words, Economic Forum, World Economic Forum. I know. It's been driven into the ground, but it keeps coming up. And it seems as if no politician, prominent business person, or media personality can't say anything without a chorus of voices saying that person is a WEF plant or something. It's really kind of actually gotten out of control. Unfortunately, after a couple of years of bad government policy, a massive increase in authoritarianism, and some conspiracy theories actually proving to be true, though, the WEF thing really grows some legs. The thing with the WEF is that it isn't a conspiracy. It's right there in front of us. It's a group of elitists headed by Klaus Schwab who meet annually and discuss plans and means to bring about world socialism. They openly speak of using what they call the Great Reset as a means to expand government and reset the economic systems of the world into some sort of form of centralized collectivism. Now, while the wish list of the WEF is bold and odious, it doesn't mean they're actually getting anywhere with it. While they like to brag about how many decision makers they have on board, they don't exert nearly the amount of control that many attribute to them. I mean, just because a person's attended one of their events doesn't mean that they embrace the ideology of the group. Or just because the group's endorsed or referenced somebody, it doesn't mean that person's controlled or even approves of that group. If you label everybody as a WEF adherent, nobody is a WEF adherent. Now, some people really are adherents to the WEF ideology. Some people really think the organization's plans are a great idea and that governments should be implementing them. We don't need to do some sort of deep dive to find these folks, like the World Economic Forum itself. It's right in the open. So I'm going to play a 2-minute clip of Conservative Party of Canada leadership contender Jean Charest as he spoke to Terry Malusky back in 2018 with the CBC about the World Economic Forum. And let's hear what Jean Charest has to say about that organization.
Premier of Quebec and the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Charest. I'm very glad you were able to join us, Mr. Charest, and I appreciate your time very much. I want you to know, first of all, if I can ask you, how can this trip to Davos serve Trudeau's purpose? I mean, how important is it really in promoting Canadian business? Does it make a difference?
Well, Davos is an interesting opportunity. I went 9 times as Premier of Quebec, and the advantage, Terry, is that there are a lot of decision makers concentrated in the same place, same time, and you can meet a lot of people and get a lot of work done.
You've been there so many times. Give me an example. I mean, what happens that actually, I'm thinking of the CETA example.
Yes.
Which grew out of, I think, you tell me if this is right or wrong, out of some backroom meeting you had at Davos, right?
In 2007. And there were a number of people in Europe at the time that I consulted. One of them was the ex-president of Mexico who had done that, a gentleman named Zedillo. So the point is that's where you can meet these people and get things done. So it is a place where you can advance your cause, but it's also a place where typically countries like India or China will go to present themselves.
Okay, final word now on the big picture, I guess. For most people watching this, they know that Davos is a place where the fancy people in private jets go and talk about things and have a great time and maybe hit the ski slopes. What can you point to tell the average folks that it makes a difference, that the economic results actually do emerge from Davos? You mentioned CETA. Well, that was a long time. That was 2007. Yeah. What have you done for us lately?
Well, Terry, it's very simple. First of all, I don't know of a single politician went to Davos who actually skied. Look at it as a shopping center for politicians, in the sense that it's an opportunity where you can meet a lot of political investors that are companies that will or have or are interested in investing in your country in a very short period of time. And it's a very efficient way of doing business if you look at it that way. So even, yes, it is elitist. It is, there's no doubt about that, movie stars and people. But at the end of the day, a prime minister can get a lot of good work done in Davos when they're well organized to meet a lot of decision makers.
Jean Charest, always a pleasure to have you on, sir. Thanks for this.
Thank you.
Jean Charest, former Premier of Quebec.
So yeah, I mean, as can be seen and heard, there's no nefarious hidden agenda. It's all right there in front of us. Charest's being candid, if nothing else. And I don't fault Charest for admitting the event is elitist. Any gathering of world leaders will indeed be so by nature. I agree, meetings need to be held between politicians and business leaders in order to get things done. What I don't agree with, though, is that these meetings need to be done with a group that carries an open mandate to take advantage of world misery due to a pandemic in order to impose what they call a reset. This is disturbing. Conferences and gatherings are essential and they need themes. They need to be held with a more neutral platform, though, than what the World Economic Forum offers. World leaders can gather without tying themselves into what that group does. I mean, those celebrating the World Economic Forum do at least expose themselves to us for what they are. They're the people who want to expand the state. These are the folks that want to bring about world socialism. These are the people who don't feel they should be guided by citizens. They feel they should be directing them. If we want to empower citizens, if we want to protect and expand personal freedoms, if we want to reduce the reach of government, we need to avoid WEF-linked leadership at all costs. When deciding who to support in elections and leadership races, it's worth seeing if the contenders support the WEF. Don't worry, it won't be hard to see them if they do. As with Trudeau and Charest, they tend to wear it right on their sleeves. But again, quit trying to paint anybody and everybody as being WEF-controlled as well, though. If they say they don't support the group, they likely don't. Those who support it make no secret about it. So watch these things, keep track, guys. It's for real, but again, it's not as widespread as some other people might think. Now, you know, so somebody else saying, where was that? Somebody saying Charest is a liberal plant. He's not a plant. Again, it's not a conspiracy. He is a liberal. He was a liberal premier of Quebec for years there. Nothing hidden, nothing secret, and he's still a liberal. He's just running for a party that happens to have conservative in the name. So let's bring Dave Naylor in to check in with the news and see what's happening in other areas outside of the crazed international conspiracies. Hey, Dave, how's it going?
Oh, hang on, wait a minute. I thought I was on the Danielle Smith show.
No luck. You're still on that second-tier show with Morgan.
Well, this is a great disappointment to me, Cory. A great disappointment.
Yes.
How did your naked Easter egg hunt go on the weekend? Out at the compound?
Well, we dropped our property values by about 20%, but I found most of the eggs.
I'd hate to be one of your neighbors, in all honesty. What do we have in the news today? Well, the federal government had set up a multi-million-dollar fund to help Ottawa businesses recuperate from that terrible, terrible truckers convoy. But not surprisingly, there's not many businesses signing up for it, probably because they don't need the help. It's 37% undersubscribed from what the Liberals had set aside. There's also a poll stating what is the bleeding obvious. Majority of Canadians think electric cars are too expensive. Yeah, no kidding. When the average price is 58 grand and the average car price is 48 grand, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where people are going to most spend their money. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has released a sort of report card on which provinces were the worst violators of people's freedoms during COVID lockdowns. Not really surprisingly, but Quebec took the top spot, taking away most people's freedoms there. Other news, we've got Alex Jones, the InfoWars guru down in the States, has claimed bankruptcy, basically owes $10 million to the families of the Sandy Hook massacre, which he claimed was a false flag operation and never happened. So he's gone to court to try and protect whatever little money he's got left. Our Christopher Oldcorn, who's coming on your show shortly, has an update on Saskatchewan COVID figures, and they're climbing slowly upwards. DuckDuckGo has responded to rumors. They're a search platform. The rumor was since last month that they were going to take all independent media like us out of their search engines, but their CEO has come forward and said, no, not true, just another one of those fake news stories. Chris has got another story on the end of the Saskatchewan gun amnesty program. RCMP and municipal forces getting 241 guns potentially off the streets in Saskatchewan. And Dr. Dennis Modry, who performed the first heart transplant in Alberta years and years ago, he's now more on the political bent. He's got a column asking whether or not Pierre Poilievre really does understand Western alienation and the fears of or the feelings of why many Albertans want to separate. So that's what we've got up now. Draw your attention, Cory, to this afternoon where our Melanie Risden will have another interview with Dr. Nagasi. He is one of the more outspoken doctors against the basically against the mantra of not being able to use other drugs. He was suspended from all Alberta hospitals for using unprescribed drugs to treat COVID patients. So he's very controversial, and I'm sure it'll be a great show coming up later on this early evening, I believe, on our website, Cory.
Great. Well, lots on the go as we head into the Easter week. I mean, not everybody has escaped with spring break and things such as that, and so we'll carry on reporting on it. Thanks for checking in. I'll talk to you later.
No, and I think we have to congratulate our boss man. Derek Fildebrand became the proud father of a bouncing baby boy this morning with Emma. Baby Fritz came in at a whopping 8 pounds, 15 ounces. Excuse me. So I'm sure Derek will be in later on handing out cigars.
Yeah, we'll see about that. But yes, the Fildebrand clan has expanded this week. It was worth mentioning. So glad everything went well for him. And we'll get a break from Derek for a little while.
Exactly. No more ties after your show.
Right on. Thanks, Dave.
You bet.
All right. And that's a good reminder to bring up from Dave. Yes, Melanie Risden, and she's been doing shows and interviews regularly, and they've been very well received. I'm sure a lot of you have already been watching them. Because Mel does them not on a regular basis, say like me or Danielle with scheduled shows, that's just that reminder. Subscribe everywhere, guys. That's how you're going to find these things. That's how you're going to catch these shows when they come out. So whether you're on Rumble, YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, we stream everywhere. We stream into LinkedIn. I saw a LinkedIn commenter coming in through there. But make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button if that platform has it, things like that, because you'll see these specials as they pop up. You know, sometimes we do them as news breaks. We don't give much warning. So it's really important to subscribe and keep those things going so you catch these as they come out. And Mel's stuff is always really good. Also, subscribe to the Western Standard itself. There's that reminder. We talk about DuckDuckGo. It sounds like they backed off. They're not going to get into the business of saying who's real media and who's not media. Unlike our federal government, who has determined that rebel media is not real media. Really? I mean, I don't know. You don't have to like Ezra and Rebel, but whose place is it to say what is or isn't official media? This is dangerous territory to go into. Either way, we don't care. We rely on subscribers to determine whether we're giving a valid, decent product out or not. We rely on you guys, and it's been great. Subscriptions have been going fantastic. That's why we've got these reporters across the country, and I do have to keep nagging and reminding all of you, though, if you haven't subscribed already, hey, what are you waiting for? Get in there, help us out. Plus, you get a product. We're not asking for a donation. We're asking for a subscription. That means you're going to get full unfettered access for $10 a month, $99 a year. or even less. If you use the coupon code TRIGGERED, you'll get another $10 off. It's less than you used to pay for a newspaper subscription, but it helps us. All the thousands of subscribers gives us the budget and ability to get reporters across this country and get good original news content out to you. So thank you all who have subscribed already. And again, if you haven't subscribed yet, get on there and do so, guys. Maybe I'll speak quickly, actually, of one of our sponsors. Since I was at a firearms show on the weekend there, and I did meet with them. That's one of the interviews I've got up. Was if you go to our YouTube channel and Facebook and that, I spoke with Tony Bernardo of the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. And they had a setup there. They had a draw going on. And what these guys are just good advocates for legal, responsible firearm use. They are an association, as it makes it sound like. You got all sorts of resources there. They got links, whether you want to go for firearms training, or where there's firearms sporting events, or where there are gun shows and trade shows. They have all of that on their website, and they're advocating for you. They've had legal challenges in the past to make sure that they are protecting your right to safely and legally enjoy firearms against the Liberal government, because they're always coming for them, guys. They're always looking to take away your property. And if you don't stand up for it, you're going to be out of luck. So get on there, check them out, take out a membership, as with us, because, hey, if we don't stand up for ourselves, nobody's going to do it for you. CSSA-CILA.org. It's the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. If you own firearms or you're looking to own firearms, you got to get on and join those guys. All right, before our next guest gets here, let's talk a little bit about some of the news items Dave brought up. Here's the no-brainer of the week, right? Electric cars are unpopular. No crap. Like, how long do we have to go through it? Well, we know we're going to have to go through it for a long time. It's been years and years, billions and billions of dollars on promotions, on rebates, on, infomercials, you name it. And only 5% of Canadians say they own or lease a vehicle that runs on electricity. 5%, 95% of us don't. And we don't want to. People aren't rushing out, even though there's $5,000 cash rebates and all these things to join charger stations. They have to admit it's not there, but they won't. So we're talking about now, they're moving on to banning the sale of combustion engine cars. They're talking about putting quotas on salespeople. They're talking about forcing plants to get retooled. We're going to be in a lot of trouble, guys, a lot of trouble. I'll tell you, if you want a good investment right now, start buying gasoline and diesel-powered cars, because if these morons in office carry on like they have, these collector's items are going to be worth a fortune when we have nothing but electric cars available that cost a fortune, don't have good charging facilities, don't have good range, don't work well in wintertime, and don't have a decent resale value. But, well, public opinion be damned. I mean, this gets back to a government that wants to tell you what to do rather than serve. A government that doesn't trust you on your own to make decent decisions for yourself, for the environment around you, or for anything like that. They feel they have to be top down, guiding you, pushing you, or even forcing you. It's that attitude from government, and it's very disturbing and distressing. It's problematic. And that's just another symptom of it. Pollsters can find out what Canadians want, but our government, they can find out too. They poll like crazy. The problem we got with our government right now is they don't care what we want. It doesn't matter. They've got an ideology, and they're going to push it. And they're going to try and change us. There's a term that used to be used a lot in the past. We used to use over and over, social engineering. It's kind of fallen out of use, but it's true. They're trying to change our behavior. It's such an arrogant attitude, an elitist attitude, the great unwashed masses. We have to model them into this better world of what we think. Look, guys, we're evolving. We're getting better. The world, for the most part, is a better place. People are better people than they were 30 years ago, and we're going to continue to be. Stay out of our hair, because the government's agenda isn't necessarily the same as ours. And when you get in stirring around with us, it doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. Okay, well, let's get on. Speaking of buzzwords and things like that, to our first guest for today, and he's been on before. This is author Mark Milke, and he put a column out with us recently on, it was called The Latest Hit to Taxpayers and Entrepreneurs, Pay Equity Salaries are Based on Apple Banana Comparison. So let's bring Mark in and discuss what he was getting at there. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
Corey, I am doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Great. No, it's always good to get you here, and you hit on some of these subjects that a lot of people don't like talking about, and that's one of those ones. It's those two words, equity and equality. They sound so similar. They're kind of in related fields, But they're very different things, aren't they?
Well, it's a bit Orwellian. I first wrote on pay equity back in the Financial Post 25 years ago, and we're still dealing with this issue. The notion of pay equity is basically about equal value, equal pay for jobs of equal value. Now, that's the catch right there, value. How do you value jobs? Well, usually the market values a job. If you get a whole bunch of people that are 17 years old, 18 years old, and they're available to work at McDonald's, they're probably going to be paid different than, say, a mining engineer, who has to go to university and get training in both the mines and in engineering. So, but pay equity has come about basically because of lobbying, in part by government unions over the years. That was the first column I wrote on it 25 years ago. More recently, the Doug Ford government in Ontario talked about pay equity. It has a pay equity office, as it turns out. They ran an entire advertorial in the Globe and Mail lauding pay equity. Now, you often hear this in the context of women make 2/3 of what men do. No, they don't. That's an average, right? And averages hide a whole bunch of reasons why, when you tally up all the money men make, all the money women make, and come up with an average, that doesn't tell you about hours worked. It doesn't tell you about degrees. It doesn't tell you about time taken off or out of the workforce to raise children, so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of problems with the notion of pay equity, as opposed to equality of pay for the exact same job, which is a very different concept.
Yeah, and that causes a lot of confusion and such. But I mean, just framing it that way, it sounds unfair to people. But I mean, if it was the exact same job and somebody was paid based on one gender versus another a different amount, I mean, that's illegal. It has been for a long time.
It's been illegal since the 1950s in Ontario, for example. I mean, in the early 1950s, Ontario passed laws against discrimination in employment, in lodging, in much else based on color, based on gender. Now, this is part of the problem today, is that people don't know their history, not only their legislative history, but they don't know their legislative history, and they don't know their legal history, their statistical history. They don't know how to break down statistics properly or averages. So you get these nonsensical declarations that somehow Canada is this bastion of inequality. No, it's not actually. I mean, if you're an employer in Canada, and again, using the example of Ontario, at any point in the last 70 years, you could be hauled into court for discrimination if you pay, a woman differently than a man for the exact same job. Now, there may be cases, I'm sure there have been cases, where employers have tried to get around that. But the point is, it's been illegal for 7 decades. It's not about equality. Pay equity is about it's a rubbery concept of, say, trying to compare clerical workers in the federal civil service, which is actually what I began writing about 25 years ago, and where there was some massive settlement to them worth billions of dollars just because it happens to be female dominated. The argument is female dominated professions have historically been paid lower because they're female dominated, say clerical work historically. Well, that's a bit questionable. There are male dominated professions such as soldiering, which actually pay quite low when you tally up the risk of working in that profession. And there's inequalities between male dominated professions such as the NHL and soldiering. I mean, not the average, but the pay range I could find if you're in the Canadian Armed Forces, starting at a very basic level, was something like $36,000. And I think the highest was around $180,000. Well, in the NHL, a starting salary, another male-dominated profession, is $900,000, and the top salary is $20 million in Canadian dollars. So those are two male-dominated professions, and there are very different reasons, of course, why NHL players make a lot of money and soldiers don't. A lot of people go to NHL games, and advertisers spend a lot of money on the NHL, paying the NHL, and so do fans. So there's a reason why the NHL pays a lot better in a male-dominated profession, and soldiers are not paid that well, which is another male-dominated profession. But unless you break these things down, you get stuck in this morass of somehow we live in a great age of inequality when it comes to pay between men and women. It ain't so.
Well, and then you start getting into that sensitive area for a lot of people, or politically dangerous area, but of acknowledging that there are some differences in inclinations, generally among different genders. I mean, of course, there's many women drawn to the STEM fields, and there's many men drawn to nursing or other, the cross-gender type of areas, but there's still areas that will remain predominantly dominated by one gender or another, and we should be allowed to admit that.
Well, and there may well be. I mean, Jordan Peterson made this argument famously about 5 years ago and got into trouble for it, got into trouble in quotes on a UK television interview, which is what sent him into the stratosphere around the world in terms of his publicity for his book, right? When he said, look, the Nordic countries have done everything they can to equalize opportunity, to make sure women have the opportunity to enter the workforce, especially when their children are young, so on and so forth. Nonetheless, there seems to be average differences between the choices that men and women make. Look, let's also look at, say, racial incomes. As it turns out, if you're a Taiwanese Canadian, the average income in the 2016 census was $51,000, or the median income rather. A Somali Canadian, the median income in that year for someone who worked full year, full time, was $36,000. That's a $15,000 difference. Now, what goes into the differences between those two groups, Somali Canadians and Taiwanese Canadians? Well, Taiwanese Canadians on average have higher education levels, more university degrees as a proportion of the population. And Somali Canadians, on average, are newer to Canada. The average, person who's lived in Canada who has a Somali background is newer than a Taiwanese Canadian, or Taiwanese Canadians may have been here for several generations in some cases. So there are differences in incomes because you can't simply come to a country and then start at the top of the economic or career profession. So there's all sorts of reasons why pay equity is such a flawed concept. And the language itself is really deceiving because, again, people think you're talking about equality, the same job, the same pay, and you're not. You're talking about these value comparisons as if you can compare, say, clerical workers in the federal government to soldiering, which are, female dominated and male dominated respectively.
Yeah, well, and I mean, most good business models, are going to naturally gravitate to try and compensate the person who's providing more value to them. I'm certain there's some prejudiced managers and business owners out there, but for the most part, they understand it. We're getting better. We're beyond that. You just want the best person for that job, and it's just not going to matter what race or gender demographic or even sexual orientation is anymore.
The American economist Thomas Sowell has made this point many times that, look, if you think somebody who practices discrimination based on gender or race is going to end up hurting themselves in their own business, because then you're going to hire people based on some qualification like skin color. So if you're prejudiced against Black Canadians and you hire someone who's white for that reason alone, you'll miss out on top-notch talent. Because of your prejudice, it'll drag down your business, it'll hurt your profits. So discrimination is actually a bad economic policy as well. But it has been illegal for 70 years in Canada, depending on the province. So, but pay equity has never been about equality between, for the exact same pay for the exact same job. It has been about this rubbery notion of, well, we think we can compare workers in various cohorts and somehow come up with, an equality measurement, an equity measurement, and then we should pay them the same, as opposed to, listen, there are reasons why, for example, clerical work, or say the real estate profession, attracts certain people, because there's low barriers to entry, right? And there's a difference between that and perhaps doing deep science research and getting a PhD, in neuropsychology. That's going to weed out most of us. So there are reasons, again, why certain professions attract a lot of people, and also the pay is perhaps lower, especially in the clerical profession, because you don't have to go to university for 12 years and learn something about neuropsychology. So of course, clerical work is going to be paid less than neuropsychology, irrespective of whether it's male dominated or female dominated.
Yeah, well, and there's been a lot more participation from females and women in the STEM trades in the last few years, I believe, than there used to be as well. So, we're going to see them coming into the workforce or developing into senior positions pretty soon, I would imagine.
Well, these things take decades to work out. There were women in senior positions already in the workforce. Obviously, CEOs and others. Here's the way to think about pay equity. Let's take the example of an all-female law firm. This is a hypothetical example I gave in my column in the Western Standard. Imagine 100 lawyers, all female, hired at the same time, went to the same university, had the same grades. Let's go with the example, because this is the only way to understand the flaw in pay equity psychology and claims. Let's suppose 50 women of those 100 women that are hired at the same time take 5 years off or 10 years off to raise kids, come back to the same law firm. Are the 50 female lawyers that stayed at the law firm that entire time, those entire 10 years, are those 50 women going to say, yeah, you who have come back now to the firm, former colleague of mine with 5 years less experience, can now make what I do? Of course not. because it's not about gender in this case. What it's about is experience, time served in the law firm. So even a 100-person female law firm, you're going to see discrimination between women, between the women who have served 10 years in the law firm and have more experience and those who served only 5 years because they took time off to raise children, for example, in this particular example. So the flaw with pay equity is it assumes all choices are equal, and they're not. And so they don't account for those career breaks. They don't account for education in many cases. They don't account for the time, say, a new cohort, a new immigrant group is in the country versus an established group, all of those factors. So the Doug Ford government, by pushing the pay equity concept, is pushing a pretty flawed notion of why people get paid the way they do.
Yeah, so I was wondering, though, what's inspiring an ostensibly conservative government such as Doug Ford's, especially going into an election period, to dive into this morass? I mean, was there really pressure outside of perhaps organized labor to move in this direction, or is it just being reactive perhaps and not really paying close attention to what people are concerned about?
I'm not sure how long that the Ontario Pay Equity Office has been in existence. It may have predated the Doug Ford government, but I'm surprised it's still there. And plus, politicians frankly don't have time to think deeply about some of these matters. So perhaps, the Premier himself or others, in the Ontario caucus haven't given it any thought. It wouldn't be the first time politicians live on a phrase and think, well, that sounds nice. Who could be against equity? But it's not the same as equality. So I think it's in part because this has been pushed for a quarter century by government unions in particular. And this is where I first noticed it in the late 1990s. And it's very costly to taxpayers. It's also an interference in the marketplace because, again, some professions you're going to have a lot more supply of labor, and that drives down the price of that labor vis-a-vis, again, more specialized professions. Public professions such as the NHL, where, of course, a lot of money flows into the NHL, as I mentioned a moment ago, from consumers and advertisers. So it's a male-dominated profession, pretty much all male, I think. And but they're paid, multiples, of course, again, of what a soldier does. Now, in not a perfect world, in a world where somehow we could quantify value exactly, if we had that omniscient ability, of course, a soldier is worth more in some value concept. We value them more in some notion than we do an NHL player, because soldiers put their lives on the line, but they're paid a 20th really of if that of what soldiers are paid. So again, this says you can't really value professions based on value. You have to let the market decide, or what taxpayers can afford to pay soldiers.
So, I mean, as we keep swirling that, though, because they're difficult buzzwords to battle against. I mean, they're feel-good things. People just, if they're not going to look deeply at it, they'll support these things. But, I mean, this can really make a mess of some employment markets, public sector and private sector, if we carry on.
And it makes a mess of taxpayer finances. When I first wrote on this a quarter century ago, I can't believe it's been that long, in the Financial Post, I had women call me up who were entrepreneurs and others who said, I get what's happening. It's government unions trying to shove more money in the direction of government employees. And they were outraged. They'd phone me up about my Financial Post column. This is the reaction I've had from entrepreneurs. There's an employer up in Fort McMurray who runs a medical company, nursing company, basically. She mentioned to me a couple of years ago that she's got to pay clerical workers much higher than they would be, and she would have to pay in the private market because she's competing with government jobs. So that's what pay equity arguments have done. Again, on this claim that female-dominated professions in the past have been lower paying because they're female-dominated, as opposed to, again, the example of clerical work, where there are a few barriers to entry, lots of supply of labor. And frankly, people can get in and out of that quickly as they decide to go back and, provide for their children for a couple of years, or work with their children full time, as opposed to, work in the private sector workforce outside the home. So these are the things that drive salaries. And my female friend in Fort McMurray, who runs a health company, saw it when she started to pay $80,000 for an assistant, because the pay was driven up by the government sector because of these artificial boosts, because of pay equity increments in the civil service that really did start about 25 years ago.
Well, and as times are getting fiscally tight, I mean, we hope some of these areas that we can just apply some more common sense and just kind of get back to rationality.
Well, again, the example of 50 female lawyers that stay at a law firm throughout their careers, they're not going to, if they're running the law firm, no one else is, it's not a male dominated firm, they're not going to go pay 50 female lawyers who took time off the same as they get paid, because they understand that time served equals higher rates of pay. You get to bill higher for that sort of experience.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, the private market, we know, will be driven that way, but the public market, public sector doesn't, unfortunately, pivot that necessarily as well. But I guess that's our responsibility as voters, to try and push for these policies and try and get better, employment policies.
Well, it starts by telling the truth. Paying men and women differently for the exact same job has been illegal since the 1950s.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate your being willing to even, bring up and broach those subjects, because it has been too sensitive for a lot of people. So as we kind of wrap up here, though, so I see you're the president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. That's a new think tank you fired up.
It's something I've been thinking about for years, actually, since Jordan Peterson kind of came to prominence. And I thought it's good that he's pushing back on issues of forced expression. It's good that he's taken a very empirical approach, which is why we've named it after Aristotle, really the original empiricist, or one of the first empiricists in Western history anyway, that I'm aware of, right 2.5 millennia ago. So this idea came up about 5 years ago, but more recently, we've started it up. We're applying for a charitable number, precisely to look at some of these issues related to reason, related to science, relating to statistics, and more broadly related to democracy and related to civilization. I think there's everything these days seems to go to an extreme right away, or there seem to be these extreme claims that have been popping up, especially during COVID, from all over the place, but in the past couple of years in general, I think. And we've started the Aristotle Foundation to say, look, civilization, has come about because of a lot of hard work and a lot of sacrifice of past generations. Maybe we should learn from the Enlightenment. Maybe we should, tack back to reason, as opposed to ramping everything up and being tribal in every bad sense of that word in the past couple of years. So the Aristotle Foundation hopefully will be public later this year, but I've started to write some columns and make note that it is coming.
Great. And before I let you go, I guess I'll get you a chance to remind everybody you've got a great book out there about the victim cult. Where can people find that? The Victim Cult: How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Thanks for the plug, Cory. It's available online, Amazon.ca, Chapters, Indigo, your local bookstore. So and in fact, it describes a lot of the problems that I've discussed on your show and elsewhere before, and the problem with this age of everyone's a victim and everyone's making these extreme claims based on their own ostensible victimization, as opposed to sometimes digging down into the data or thinking reasonably about issues and say, well, I'm told the reason, for something is X, but maybe the reason is Y. So it's my attempt to get a little more thought into public debate. Great. Well, thanks for coming on to talk to us today, Mark, and I appreciate you, writing on those subjects and talking about the things some other people are a little too afraid to get into. So I do appreciate it, and I hope we can talk again soon. Anytime, Cory. Certainly. Great. Thanks. So yes, that was Mark Milke of what's going to be the Aristotle Foundation coming up soon, and he's been involved with many, many other groups. I believe the Fraser Institute, the Taxpayers Federation. I read a book quite a while back. I don't know if I want to date him that much, but I think it was called Tax Me, I'm Canadian. I believe that was his as well, and that was some years back. That helped inspire me as a young up-and-coming politico. Many great examples of the horrific waste of our dollars in that book. So check it out, guys. And Mark's always great to talk to with injecting some common sense into some of these issues that are ongoing. So let's look at some of these other issues as we're looking at things. We've got some more of those stories. Oh, yes, I think Dave mentioned that. So it's been determined by the Department of Environment that the standstill due to the pandemic and travel bans has been good for the climate. Now, this is a disturbing conclusion that some government bureaucrats have gotten into, and I do get worried when they start talking this way. Because sure, if we crush the economy enough, if we stuff people in their homes, if we basically break everybody enough, we're going to emit a little less. We're going to have a little less impact on the environment. And when people take environmentalism to the point of a cult, that sounds like a cost benefit worthy of pursuing on their part. But I mean, look at what we've gone through this last 2 years, and look at the recovery we're going to be going through for the next few years. It's not worth it for whatever these guys are saying for the difference it made to the environment anyways. A quarter of a degree over 50 years or some insane minute amount of change, if indeed it makes one. These guys are looking, and this is getting back to kind of what I was talking about with the Great Reset. This is when we get bureaucrats and political leaders and others looking at the pandemic, looking at a disaster. And that's what it is. It's been a 2-year world disaster. And I'm not even talking about the deaths caused by COVID-19. I'm talking about the pressures caused by the lockdowns, the responses, the restrictions, the social cost, the fiscal cost, all of those costs that nobody likes to talk about in government that came from the government's actions on the pandemic had nothing to do with the virus. The virus can't affect your economy. Government responses to it can, and they do. The Great Reset, getting back to that. That's people who see this is an opportunity. If we can just tear things down enough, we can remodel them and build them in a way we like. And it's not just economics. So when you see these guys talking about it with the environment as well at the same time, they're just looking at this as an opportunity. Hey, you know what? We've proven it now. If we just beat the economy down enough, we'll save all the fluffy bunnies, we'll stop global warming, and maybe David Suzuki's house and Al Gore's houses on the coast won't get flooded when the waters rise. Maybe. But I mean, these reports coming out, this is distressing. And I worry about that. And of course, Stephen Guilbeault says something along the lines of process happens step by step with this year's report to the United Nations. We can see that Canada is moving in the right direction. So Guilbeault believes we're moving in the right direction. He believes, because of our emissions have gone down. They fell in all but 2 provinces. Alberta went up 8%. Good for us. And Manitoba went up 6%. But again, that's because we're actually working and providing product for people throughout this. I mean, we needed more energy as we went. So yes, our emissions went up. Get over it. The hypocrisy of the interregional crap that we deal with people consuming fuel, with people heating their houses with gas, with people electricity. A lot of it's natural gas fired. It's coal. It's things like that. And then they turn around and support extremists like Guilbeault saying we got to shut down Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, even with their energy, BC. They don't understand they're kicking themselves in the nuts. But they are, and that's what they're pushing with. So that's why even as things slow down, Alberta's emissions went up. But it's not because we're evil, nasty Albertans, though we are, and that's fine. I'll embrace my evil nastiness as far as the establishment's concerned and many Central Canadians. But it's because no matter how bad the pandemic was, we still had to produce energy. You have to do it. You still got to drive your car. You still have to heat your house. This is Canada. We will die if we don't produce these energy sources. Unicorn dust and the laughter of children won't keep you warm in January. We need to burn fossil fuels for that. But this is where we are sitting, and that's where the discourse and the dialogue are right now. Global warming, I'll be discussing some of that maybe with Chris Oldcorn when he does come in a little bit here, because Saskatchewan and Manitoba, boy, they've been enjoying that global warming to the tune of a couple of feet of snow in April. Speaking of Saskatchewan, we don't pay enough attention to our neighbors to the east. So I'm glad to have Chris out there because, Saskatchewan and Alberta have such parallel issues, parallel attitudes, parallel economies. I do feel if and when the independence movement really gets a rolling, it has to be province by province. But I'd like to see Alberta and Saskatchewan moving lockstep. But there's a story that came out with it's a town, the hamlet of Big Beaver, Saskatchewan. And there was not a single vote for a Liberal in that whole town. Not a one. And I know this isn't a giant city or anything, but still to have an entire town where you didn't get a single vote, that's something to be celebrated. So a shout out to the residents of Big Beaver, Saskatchewan. Not only is the name of your town fodder for many, many tasteless jokes, but at the same time, Big Beaver is also a place that will not vote Liberal. I hope that you set an example of tastelessness and good voting that the rest of the country can continue to follow up with. Let's see. So Conservative MP Robert Kitchen won Big Beaver with 85% of the vote. And looks like it's near the Montana border, has 65 electors. So yeah, not a whole lot. But you know what? 0 out of 65 is the same as 0 out of 100 is the same out of 0 out of 100,000. That was the perfect Liberal voting turnout. So Mr. Kitchen, make sure you pay attention to your Big Beaver down in South Saskatchewan because they value you. And if you take them for granted, you might end up getting a couple of Liberal voters down there. And that would be humiliating after you've set this great example of that. We saw, Wapella, Saskatchewan, they had 354 people and they had one Liberal ballot. But, that could have been a typo. They also said in the story that lone ballots are usually actually cast by party scrutineers. The party's always going to have at least one representative in there watching the polls. But they got a lot. So, so let's celebrate some good news things. Let's see, another without a Liberal supporter, Kola, Manitoba, 1,500 people there. And that town didn't have a single Liberal supporter either. So, Saskatchewan's not alone. See, I like to report on good news stories now and then, talk about stuff that's upbeat. Getting onto the downbeat again now. Let's see. Mike Thomas, he was in last week. He's great when we get him in and talking on the show. And he's written a good column on the Western Standard just to remind everybody as well that the bank rate is going to hit everyone in the pocketbook. Everybody knows this. Nobody likes to talk about it, but they got to face it. Some are denying it. It says the major goal is to extinguish Canadian housing markets that have been on fire in the last 2 years and stabilize prices, a process that may have started before the increase. Of course, the problem with that is when the government starts getting in, trying to directly impact markets, trying to directly change markets, they make a mess of markets. And then you get into seesaws and ups and downs. So, the inflation is putting pressure on everybody. It can't remain unchecked like that for too much longer. Increasing our, economic development and things like that would help with it. Bringing more things on for supply in general, such as energy supply, such as housing supply, things like that. Getting off of our farmers' case so our food supplies are better dealt with, that would help. Or getting rid of that supply management policy, which no federal conservative politician is willing to do yet that I can find. But there are things we can do to battle inflation besides just trying to cool off the economy by cranking up interest rates. But the government's not willing to try them. So unfortunately, we're going to be looking forward to some more raising prices, guys. So let's see here. An anti-fraud expert fears the Liberals' newly announced Canada Financial Crimes Agency is going to turn out to be ineffectual or worse, persecute some Canadians as was done under the Emergencies Act. Yeah, because the government can't get anything right. That's the reality of it. Even if they mean well. Hey, this sounds good. Financial Crimes Agency. We're going to crack down on those nasty financial crimes, people committing fraud, people stealing from each other. But again, this is going to try and coordinate with FinTrack and the RCMP and the Canada Revenue Agency because, oh boy, they're certainly competent, aren't they? And I'm sure they will battle fraud with all the efficiency that they have had with the Phoenix pay system that so far, after decades and billions of dollars spent, can't even get government paychecks correct. So I do fear, and I see the reports already coming out, though, that this anti-fraud thing might actually lead to some innocent people getting nailed or put through the ringer. And of course, I got a feeling the guilty ones are rarely going to be caught, but we'll see. I guess we'll let them keep trying. Maybe I'm going to bring our next guest in. He's in studio here, and we've had Chris on the show before, but we haven't had him here in person, and it's Christopher Oldcorn. He's our Saskatchewan bureau chief, but I'll talk about one of our sponsors as he moves into position here. Speaking of financial areas, and that's Bitcoin Well. Bitcoin Well, as you've heard from me lots of times, is a great sponsor. If you're looking to get out of typical financial vulnerability, I guess you could say, to our government's incompetence or our government's propensity to take your money and steal your funds, digital currencies are one of your ways you can hedge your bets and get clear of that. And Bitcoin Well is a good Western Canadian company. They're there, and one of their best points, I guess, as a selling point, is that they give one-on-one service. They aren't some distant call center. It's not a website you go to where a little box from some bot pops up and asks if you have a question. You make an appointment with these guys at bitcoinwell.com. You sit down with a real live person face to face, and they'll show you what digital currencies are all about. They'll show you how you can get involved in them, how you can invest in them, or maybe even if it's not for you, but that's their thing as a company, is safely bringing you into the digital currency world and showing you how you can get involved. And safely is important. You work hard for that money. You don't want some scam artist taking it off of you. So, these guys, check them out at bitcoinwell.com and see if digital currencies are for you. They really help. It's a confusing world, and it's a very educational site, I guess you could say, to help walk you through how these things work, such as cold wallets, hot wallets, and all that good stuff. Bitcoinwell.com. All right, let's get to our next guest here, and that's Christopher Oldcorn. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
It's going good. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, welcome to the Western Standard Studios.
Yes, normally I'm in my home studio.
Yes. So here you can see where I rant in person, and you can see the frothing marks on the windows and other such things. So you came out for the Easter.
Yeah, I came to visit my
Weekend,
family
visit
here.
family,
So my
right.
sister moved here 15 years ago, but my parents just moved here last summer.
Okay.
So we're all here for Easter for the first time actually in quite some time that we've all been together. So
Yeah. So some of your stories, I mean, things have been topping the news in Saskatchewan. Has been the
Yes.
horrific weather you guys have been enjoying.
yes,
Did you deal with much of that on the drive out, or was it mostly cleared, I guess, by then?
I was lucky. Like I'm based in Regina, and the highway was non-advisable to drive on if you're going east of Regina towards Winnipeg. Parts of it was actually closed for quite some time. And some areas now have gone up to about 60 centimeters in total of snow since Tuesday. Areas that had very little snow prior to that, there's actually a very funny picture of an A&W, and they have the picture of it like last weekend, and then they have a picture of it now, and you have no idea what it is. Like you can't see any orangeness on the sign, nothing. So they got really nailed south of the Trans-Canada Highway.
Yeah,
So
those true winter blasts we get out on the prairies.
Yeah.
If people haven't experienced them, they've been fortunate, but
yeah,
it just comes with living out here.
Yeah.
So how long have you been in Saskatchewan now? Is there
about a month.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it's I got there the day before the budget, basically.
Yeah.
And the budget's been quite interesting. But actually, you were mentioning something about inflation before there.
Mhm.
There is another number that's actually way higher than inflation, which is actually the wholesale inflation number. So the people that are buying the stuff to make it before it gets to the store, and their inflation is at 11.1%, which means it's going to get passed on to us because that one is like an indicator of what's coming next. So you're right. The inflation number is probably going to be double or higher what we are right now, only within a couple months.
It only stands to reason. I mean, we're getting all the alarm bells, but I don't know
Yeah.
if enough people are paying attention to it. It's funny, things get politicized a lot.
Yes.
Poilievre has taken on inflation as a big part of his campaign platform.
Yeah.
To be fair, I think in this circumstance, in this economy, inflation would be happening even if Poilievre was the
Mhm.
prime minister right now. But there are things I think that can be done differently by the federal government than
Yeah.
under Poilievre than under Trudeau. But we just can't tell people enough or warn them like this is coming. As you said, we should
Oh, yeah.
watch these indicators. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just math.
Yeah.
The wholesaler's paying this much. If they're going to make their bills, they got to raise the price.
Yeah, and the problem is trying to move stuff around right now is almost next to impossible. There's hundreds of ships with stuff on it that haven't been unloaded. And if that doesn't get unloaded and you're trying to make something, you're going to have to pay more for what is actually there. I mean, look at the cost of used cars. I mean, they're almost as high as like new cars because there's just nothing available.
Supply
So-
chains have just been a catastrophe.
Well, they messed with supply chains for like almost 3 years. What do you expect? I mean, you have just-in-time shipping being the way people have been operating, not having big warehouses of the things that they need to, let's say, make a car. It shows up and it's on the car in 2 hours. Well, when you mess with that for 3 years, guess what? You see what we have now. And no one was really thinking about that at all at the government level anyways in the last few years because they just shut things down without even thinking about it.
So on the way in, before we were talking, Alberta and Saskatchewan, we've seen a lot of parallels. I mean, we're very similar provinces in a lot of ways. There are a lot of similar challenges and issues
Yes.
going on. With the Ukraine-Russia war, with the pandemic, many other things. I mean, agriculturally, that's going to be an area of a lot of inflation and a lot of pressure. It could be advantageous to some producers, I guess, who've had a hard time, but it's still going to be very hard on consumers, I imagine.
Yeah, because where I moved from actually was in Dryden, Ontario, and we would go to the store sometimes and there'd be absolutely no meat on the shelf at all, like literally nothing, just completely empty because they sold it at a place further away, that wasn't as far away as Dryden was. So by the time the meat got to us, the truck was empty. I haven't seen that yet in Regina, but there is a lot of pressure on particularly trying to, like dairy farmers, for example, had to put their prices up 12% just because their costs are higher. When fuel goes up, everything gets more expensive, and fuel's up 48% in this past year. When you're trying to move a piece of chicken around, that piece of chicken is now a lot more expensive to take from the farmer, and the farmer has to pay more money as well because they're using fuel. So it's a compounding effect, and it's hard to turn that around and stop it.
Well, and people don't think about things like the amount of natural gas used and green dryers and heating facilities, or even power being used for pivots and irrigation blocks. I mean, farmers need a lot of power for what they do. And as we keep increasing energy costs, no matter what type of energy, it comes down to our essentials like food, unfortunately.
Yeah, and last week, Saskatchewan raised their electricity rates by 8%. And inflation in Saskatchewan is actually at 4.7. It's a whole percent below like the national rate of inflation, but they still put it up 8%. And like people are like, why are you putting up 8%? And it's kind of like, are they hedging that they know something is coming? They're expecting their costs to go higher, and that's why they did it. But it makes everything harder for everybody, whether you're the farmer, whether you're working in an office building, using electricity in your home. Everybody uses electricity and hydro, and everybody uses gas. And when those prices go up, you're stuck, and everything has to go up in price because of it.
In Saskatchewan, that's one difference to Saskatchewan and Alberta. The electricity is still a Crown Corporation. I think it's Sask Energy over there, isn't it? So that's fully, I mean, I know they call it a Crown Corporation, but it answers to the government in the end. So when it makes a rate hike like that, that's with the essentially guidance and consent of the government.
Yes, the government's actually the one that put it up, which through legislation last week, actually.
So why did they say they were raising it? I mean, what was their justification in response to that? I mean, people couldn't have been happy.
No, they gave sort of two answers. One was they had a built-in raise from a collective bargaining agreement, but that was only a 2% raise in their actual employee costs in terms of wages. And then the other excuse they gave was that they're working on these nuclear reactors, these small modular reactors. They're not a full, like what you see, like the Pickering nuclear plant. They're very small, but they can create a lot of power. And they're saying that's expensive to do, and they're trying to have one by 2030, maybe. And they partnered with a few other provinces to make these smaller nuclear reactors, but they're very expensive to make. And the question then becomes, is it worth spending all this money if you're going to cost people all this money over the next 8 to 10 years before it's finally even usable to create energy? Like, where are we going to be? Like, should they just put up some solar panels and it's way cheaper? Like, do we actually need to start putting in these nuclear reactors, or is there other ways we can use energy cheaply? I mean, gas is normally cheap, but they put so many different barriers in. So, I mean, I'm doing a story right now. It's going to be up later today on mining in Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan's the second best place in the world to explore and to mine everywhere. And a lot of it has to do with the public policy and how easy it is to do business, and then also what you have in the ground. I mean, Saskatchewan's a third of all the potash that was made last year. And the question then there is, well, that's a really good spot. But now they're getting, and there was something tabled in the legislature, they're having problems with land claims. BC ranked very poorly in this mining study because of land claims, because they take so long to move to the legal system. Saskatchewan is about to have the same problem. Last week, I actually met with the lawyer for the Indigenous group and their consultant about this exact thing. And they are moving forward with the case because right now there is a policy, and I use that term loosely, that they have to send a fax to the Indigenous tribe, and they have 30 days. And if they don't hear anything back, then that's called due diligence in Saskatchewan, hence the reason they ranked near the top of the world. Well, there was a problem with that in that they sent a fax to an Indigenous group that didn't have a fax machine anymore. They removed their fax machine. Exactly. Who keeps fax machines? So they were actually never really consulted because they never received the fax. And no one called to say, hey, why? Because normally they get a response back of if they want to talk or whatever. And they didn't, but they didn't do anything about it. And this has opened up a big problem because now there's a legal case where they didn't do their due diligence on a very large mining project.
Well, I think, to be honest, the Indigenous group probably has a very good case. I mean, you know, you might as well have a policy saying, well, we sent it through Morse code with the telegraph. Why weren't you guys listening?
That's essentially what happened. And they're like, we haven't had a fax machine. Like, they haven't had a fax machine for like 7 years or something. They're not even sure where they even got the fax machine number from because it wasn't listed on their website or any of their information. There was no fax number, but they faxed this document.
Well, let's get back to what I was talking about with government earlier. You know, these are guys who can't manage to even get their own payroll system right. This is a large
how long has that
institution
Phoenix thing been going on?
Oh, decades. And it's not just the Liberals. The Conservatives didn't fix that thing either. And that's where I get worried about bloated government in general. I mean, it plays into my ideology and biases, but government's terribly inefficient. And it's not unique to Canada. It's
no,
everywhere.
governments are just very bad at running anything. I mean, you look at countries with the largest government interference. They tend not to be economically prosperous. They tend to have very high costs for their citizens. My girlfriend's from Brazil. We met in Miami. And in Brazil, there is so much corruption that the cost of even the most basic thing is very high. I mean, it seems that every other president that they have gets sent to jail for corruption. Last one being Lula. And they're just unable to operate because the government is so big and so bloated that it hinders what goes on. And if you look at the jobs numbers from this past month, well, half of them were government jobs that were created. And I was having this discussion yesterday with some consultants, actually, who help people come to Canada. And we were talking about inflation and some of the other issues. And I said, well, it would be, because they asked me about the jobs. And I said, well, it'd be interesting, we actually had two job numbers. We have the number of how many government jobs were created and how many private sector jobs were created. Because if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, these people here are working, they're not creating enough tax money to pay for the government workers over here. So it would be useful to really know if we had two different types of job numbers. What is the percentage of private jobs to public jobs? Is it 9-to-1? Is it 10-to-1? Because the closer you get to, almost being 1-to-1, you can't afford to pay for that. So it'd be nice to know if they could actually release stats on exactly, yes, there's 9 public sector jobs for every one, private sector job for every one public sector job and things like that.
So in the broader section then with the budget though, I mean, Saskatchewan's a very resource-based economy, much like Alberta. We actually balanced our budget here. I mean, due to some credit for some responsible spending for the most part because of spiking resources. I know it makes UCP supporters cringe when I say that, but there's truth to it. I mean, you got a good break with the resource prices here. So did Saskatchewan. Was there a plan though? Does it look like they're moving towards balanced budget, or is it still kind of an endless string of deficits like so many others?
Well, here's the interesting thing. This past year, their resources jumped to $2.9 billion that they generated. The previous year was 1.3. So they got a 1.6 billion increase year over year in the money they generated from resources in the province. And they still managed to have a $400 million deficit, even when their resource revenues more than doubled. And they also put up a bunch of taxes as well, 32 new taxes and fees. And then they've put on another 8% on your electricity bill last week as well. So, and they've added PST to all kinds of things too. So and it's weird because every industry that got hit with COVID, like gyms, sports, all that, now there's PST on that. So that now if you want to go to a Rough Rider game, there's PST on that. Before there wasn't. You want to get a gym membership, there's now GST on that when there wasn't. And it's almost like they're punishing the businesses who they've been punishing for 3 years with making their product more expensive because they put the PST on it.
PST on the Rough Riders. I mean, they're getting into some dangerous waters there. I mean, that's blasphemy out in Saskatchewan. You don't.
I did a story where there was a comment from the Rough Rider organization, and they are not pleased. They feel that they are being unfairly targeted by the government, like sports and events, because that's basically where they put up a lot of the taxes.
Well, in Saskatchewan, I mean, I'd say arguably they got the best football fans in Canada. I mean, I won't.
The watermelons on their heads and everything.
Yeah, I remember working out in Saskatchewan, and I'd go into like the co-op gas station. They'd have a giant rack that's just filled with green items from toques to keychains. It's everywhere. It's just everywhere. That's just part of the identity of the province. So it shows the province is really on a tax grab mentality when they go into such blasphemy. I mean, even it makes sense. I mean, it's an entertainment thing. It's not a necessity. It should perhaps get a provincial tax, but politically, you've always got to think about what it looks like and who you're going to piss off. And that couldn't have been a winner overall for them.
No, and the other thing too is they put tax on kids' clothes. Like you're putting up the price of now having a kid because now there's PST on kids' clothing where there wasn't before. So it's not just the sports and entertainment. They're making life more expensive for everyone, and especially people that need help right now. And it's a weird place in Saskatchewan because the NDP gets up and argues for tax cuts, and the Saskatchewan Party gets up and defends tax increases. It's the weirdest thing.
It's kind of bizarre. Well, I mean, I think governments move in cycles. They get too bloated and things can, way back in Alberta, to date myself, but the big threat in the end of the 80s, early 90s was the Lougheed and Getty governments had spent and borrowed. And I know people have turned Lougheed into a saint, but guys, he was not a fiscal genius when it came to those things. They poured money into some terrible things like Novotel and Gainers, and we're just wasting money. We were massively in debt. And it was the Liberals under Lawrence Decore who were polling ahead of the Conservatives. The Liberals were saying, we got to get the economy in order. And Getty was saying, no, we got to spend ourselves blind. And it was only Ralph Klein coming in with a fiscally responsible budget. I mean, the NDP in Saskatchewan might be on the right formula. In that weird irony, they might come in on a fiscally conservative platform if Mo doesn't figure things out.
And the other thing too is if you go back and look historically, the last time the NDP was in government, well, they shut down 52 hospitals. They had less doctors in the province when they finished being in government in 2007 than when they started. And they also had some big issues where they cut certain healthcare programs at the colleges and universities. And now we're seeing the problem there. So, for example, there's what's called a registered psychiatric nurse in Saskatchewan. Well, the NDP cut that program in 2001. The Saskatchewan Party brought it back in 2008. Well, they need to replace 120 psychiatric nurses right now per year that are retiring, but they're only training 80 because they can't find anyone to teach it, because the demographic that would have the experience to teach it, they weren't training anybody in the province at that time period. So they have this weird gap where they have really young psychiatric nurses and they have ones that are basically close to retirement or retired that don't want to go teach for 5 years over at, University of Regina or whatever.
Well, and that ties into one thing I'd like to hit before we finish, and that's you wrote on the healthcare, because you got hallway care going on. There's elements of the Saskatchewan healthcare system that are being overwhelmed. It's not unique to Saskatchewan either. I've had longer rants about that on problems with the entire Canadian system, but either way, that's a real problem. I mean, the government's taking in more revenue, the government's spending more. Why are you still treating people in hallways right now?
Yes, and actually in one hospital in Saskatoon, not only do they have hallway medicine, they have lobby medicine. They ran out of places to put beds in the hallway, and they had to put them in the lobby in the hospital. They also had to turn the actual waiting room for the emergency room partially into hospital beds as well. So they were actually treating people in hospital beds. And when you put people in those situations, like, for example, there's no oxygen unless you bring a machine because you can't plug it into the wall. There's all these things that are at a hospital bed that when you move that into a hallway or into an emergency room or into the lobby, none of that's there. And it creates a very unsafe working environment. And the nurses and doctors have been complaining, they're like, it's hard to, we got to move into a bigger area, so we spend more time walking around, but then it's also harder to actually treat people. And then you got to, it's like, this person needs oxygen. Do we have enough oxygen machines to move out to do that? Or do we have to move someone that's in the ER out that doesn't need oxygen and put someone in that does need? And it just becomes a logistical nightmare.
So what is it, the lack of staffing, lack of infrastructure? Why are they so short on everything?
They're up in total doctors in the province. They're up in nurses in the province. They're hiring. They just started a program in the Philippines to hire 3,000 healthcare workers over the next 2 years from the Philippines to try and help with the issues. One of the issues they did was they spent a lot of money building hospitals, but they didn't really think about staffing them. So they built this brand new, beautiful facility in North Battleford. However, it's not operational because they have very little staff. So it's a small part of the hospital is operational, but anything serious they have to send to Saskatoon because they can't deal with it there.
It's a long haul. And North Battleford, the Battlefords are a fair-sized place. I think that probably kind of ties into some bigger problems too. I haven't been there in a while, but I worked up there a number of times, and it's a tough city to live in, just to be kind of blunt. There's some social challenges in North Battleford. I can imagine it's hard to draw outside professionals to say, hey, come on up, relocate in here where we've got a small town with this high crime rate and with some issues and challenges. I'm just saying it's not trying to throw everything on the lap of government. They've got some challenges that are kind of unique, I guess, to deal with those hospitals too.
Yeah.
That Alberta had the same with what was it, Grand Cache, and they kept running out of doctors because the coal mine closed. There wasn't much money, but there's still thousands of people in this little town by the mountains. But who wants to live up there? How do you get a doctor to move up there? How do you get a nurse to move up there?
Yeah.
So
I had a friend actually moved to North Battleford about 6 months ago. And when he did his job interview, they said, well, we got to tell you one thing about the city. And he's like, okay. It's the murder capital of Canada on a per capita basis. And since he's been there, someone actually burned down a house across the road from his that was arson on purpose. Someone just did it for the fun of it. Now he hasn't seen any murders, but
good.
They were actually he literally in his job interview when they offered him a job. We're going to be upfront with you about this. And then like 2 months after he was there, he was like posting the video of this house on fire across the street from his house that was abandoned, that someone had burnt down. And this is a problem across Saskatchewan. Actually, there's a lot of boarded up houses in the downtown parts of both Regina and Saskatoon. And right now in Regina, people are living in these boarded up houses, but they keep warm, they start fires, and then the house burns down. And year over year, I talked to the Regina Fire Department about this. They're having 3 times as many house fires in the downtown area than they did a year ago. Yeah. And that's part of the problem with the SIS program, the Saskatoon Income Support Program. They have increased the amount of money that a person gets per day on that by $1. However, what that did for everybody in social housing was their total income went up, and it went up above a certain threshold, and then their rent jumped by $200. So people can't afford that. So that's why you're seeing a couple of weeks ago, I did a story in Tent City. That Tent City is way bigger than when I did the actual story on it just a few weeks ago. And more people are getting kicked out on the 15th. So I'm going to go there later this week because there's a bunch of evictions. So what we have now in Saskatchewan is a bunch of social housing that's empty, that's completely fit to live in, and they're putting people up in hotels. And the government was asked about this last week. How many hotel rooms are we getting per night? Or how much are we spending on those hotel rooms? And the government said they don't keep track of that. Well, I don't know if you know anything about accounting, but there's this thing called a balance
Accounts
sheet,
payable
income statements, and you have to kind of put numbers in that reflect what you're actually doing on the ground. They're saying they don't track this. The only thing they could tell us was they pay at least $130 per night, and they have thousands of hotel rooms every single night that they pay for. This is a huge, massive waste of government money when they have literally thousands of empty social housing that you could move into right this second.
And hotel rooms aren't that great to live in. I mean, they don't have full cooking facilities, yards, things like that you might get in another place. So I mean, they're just a stopgap. It's unfortunate because I'm glad I got you in though, because as I said, they're our eastern neighbor. I spent a lot of time working in Saskatchewan. It's Canada's most underrated province in a lot of ways, but they got a lot of challenges. I see one commenter saying he was in North Battleford for summer, and he said, some crummy people in certain places, but fine landscapes. Because again, it's beautiful up there though. It's fantastic. Some great fishing. Just as soon as you get north of North Battleford, you're getting into towards that lakes and shield country. And
and that camping, hunting, fishing is huge in Saskatchewan, from what I understand so far.
It's a misnomer. People say, "Oh, it's just this flatland." No, there's a lot more to Saskatchewan than that if you look for it, and it's a value for dollar profit. It's a great place to live too, but just sad to see so many other challenges and political crap going on as usual.
Yeah, and they kind of need to get their house in order, in particular on this this new SIS thing. It's only 2 years old. It's replaced an old program of government assistance. But the person who's in charge of it is not very competent, and that's from people around her, and also obviously from the opposition. I mean, her answer to absolutely everything is, well, we're keeping an eye on the numbers, and as we get data in, we'll make adjustments. That's literally the answer to any. You could ask her what color is the sky, and that's the answer she would give you.
Trudeau school.
It's just like the same answer for every single question. We're watching the numbers. Okay, well, what do you mean by you're watching the numbers? You had all these people that you put into the building in the middle of winter because they got kicked out of social housing and they were living in tents, and you can't live in a tent in Saskatchewan in the wintertime. Well, that was a 6-month thing, and then all those people got kicked out at the end of March. And then they're back to the tent city again because they can't get onto social assistance and get into housing that you can afford. Social assistance in Saskatchewan right now, that your housing allowance, guess how many apartment buildings in all of Regina that your housing allowance you could actually rent an apartment in? 1. Guess how many social housing units there are, or buildings there are? 2. One of the social housing units is you can't get into with the amount of housing allowance that you get from the government. It's like, who's making the system up?
Built
Like
an impossible formula.
It's built in an impossibility. And then they got up and said they wanted to get 25% of the people who are on CIS off by the end of the year. And then I asked actually in the scrum the other day, I said, well, where are these people going? And she said, well, to jobs and other opportunities. And I followed up with, well, what do you mean by other opportunities? She's like, well, they could get married and then they'd be off the program if their partner was working. And I'm like, and I'm thinking, and after she left, all of the reporters, we all looked at each other and we're like, did she just say that people should get married so that they don't have to be on government assistance anymore? Because that doesn't sound like a plan. I thought when she said other opportunities, she's going to be like, well, we're going to get them into training programs or have them go back to school or something like that. No, it was go get married. It was like either get a job or go get married are the options that she seems to think are available.
Well,
I'm like, we were just all baffled in the media scrum afterwards when she said, well, you could get married. It's like, okay.
Maybe single sites,
yeah, I mean,
postings around tent cities will start springing up.
Yeah, maybe there's a CIS dating site that they can start or something.
Hope that something better comes up before the cold weather returns in fall, because that's another clock ticking. So I appreciate you coming in today and that you're in Saskatchewan. As I said, I mean, I really love that province next door, and we don't report nearly enough on it. And we've got, yourself and others reporting from out there. We like to remind everybody there's current news, there's important news going on out there, and keep track. There's Nico brought it up, Christopher Oldcorn. He's our Regina-based reporter for the Western Standard, and you've got lots to cover, and I'm certain you'll be working further on it in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me.
Great, it's great seeing you in person, and we will talk to you later.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to frame it up with the video in a moment or two here. I've got a guest coming in tomorrow. It's going to be a little bit of a diversion from what we usually do around here. And if people watch Netflix documentaries and things such as that, or if people are close hockey watchers, they might remember the Danbury Trashers. These were a hockey team with I believe it was the UHL out in the United States in the East. And it was just a very bizarre story. I'll go more into it once that video plays to give you some background, because the founders of that team, the Trashers, the Galante family, are now doing this Ice Wars thing in Alberta, and it's coming up in Edmonton in a few weeks. And I'm going to be talking to AJ Galante tomorrow. So they're bringing in basically a new sport that's a cross between, I don't know how you describe it, ultimate fighting and hockey. So let's run the video here, and then we'll talk a little more about that.
But here we go, and I think it's going to be a good one. Take a look. And a couple right early on by Reed. Big right hit. He hits him again. That's right there. Well, another one. That one out of his mouth, so there you see him looking to be it. Oh, could be a throw. Woo! What a toe-to-toe battle!
Okay, so yes, that was just their little bit of an ad. It's going to be happening on the River Cree Casino up by Edmonton there. They're going to have, I think it's May 21st. They're going to have like 8 matches. For people, I mean, if you're not into violence and boxing and such, you're not going to like it. But if you like the hockey fights, it's that's purely what it is. They're going to be judged. I think they're 30-second or 2-minute rounds or something like that. I think it was 30 seconds toe-to-toe. But either way, I'm going to talk to AJ Galante about it. And if you guys haven't watched that documentary or don't know about the Danville Trashers, if you're ones of the fans of the old, Slapshot movie, this was a story that, I'm not going to bother AJ so much with it tomorrow. That's why I'm going into it today a little bit. Their family is, well, to be blunt, they were tied in with the Gambinos in New York, and they owned a trash company, and they had, I think, hundreds of trash trucks throughout the eastern states, and there was a lot of questionable activities with them. They bought, the father, Jimmy Galante, bought a hockey team for his 17-year-old son, AJ Galante, and they turned it into basically a goon squad like you've never seen before. It was much right out of Slapshot. They reached out and found some of the craziest goons from across the country, and it was just a scene, but it grabbed a lot of attention. This was back in 2004 to 2006, I think they lasted, before Jimmy Galante finally got nailed with a bunch of racketeering charges and went away for, I think, about 8 years. And now they've started this ice wars thing in Edmonton. I know not everybody is going to like it. I see Wanda saying it's effing stupid, and somebody saying, are we back in ancient Rome? And some people saying that's why they stopped watching hockey. Fair enough. And it's not good hockey, but they're not pretending to be. That's part of it. Maybe in a sense, this would give the overflow for the people who like watching the hockey scraps. You can watch the straight out fights with this thing over there and watch people more with the skill and finesse playing hockey on the ice within the real leagues and such. I don't know, but you really got to watch that Netflix series on it to get some background on this Galante family, because it's a really strange and interesting story. And of all places they picked to bring it up is in Edmonton to kick off their new boxing hockey / league. So it'll still be an interesting conversation, even if it isn't a thing for you. Not to mention just the interesting parts of that whole family and what they're doing and so on. It's really unusual. So I'm going to have him on tomorrow, and we'll talk about that. And like I said, watch that Netflix series on the Danbury Trashers. It's quite the story to watch and read anyways. Untold, there it is, Crime and Penalties. Again, it's not terrible. It's got some moments, but it's not terribly violent, but it really gives a background of a really unusual league set up by some people of that sort of interesting family background out in the New York and Connecticut area. Just giving that plug on the way in. And somebody's saying, straight up enforcer fighting, seriously. Yeah, if you don't like it, don't buy tickets. I mean, it's as simple as that. I'm not big onto the things as myself so much with that and everything, but I got no fault if they're grown, willing participants and people want to pay ticket prices to go see it. Go to town. Something different. Speaking of division and fighting, though, I just want to talk a little more, too, about some of the stuff yesterday. I don't want it to sound like I'm a full-out cheerleader for Pierre Poilievre. We can't help but constantly report on it because he's making waves across this country, though. His campaign has been something else. I haven't seen energy like that before. I went to the rally last week with that. We're seeing those rallies packing places full all over the place. And we are watching the Canadian establishment and media, I talked about that last week, just going nuts. He has got them terrified. And there was this meltdown by Frank Graves of Ecos. He owns Ecos Research, and they put out polls and polling, and he went on Twitter with just a tirade that he did delete, and he kind of in a backhanded, there it is, a backhanded way apologized, but not really. So, I mean, he says, sorry that Jenny Byrne, Jeff Ballingall, and the countless racist dickheads who don't like me. If you hang with Nazis, you are Nazis, and I am coming for you. And you can call me a raving lunatic, and I will. You're a raving lunatic, Graves. And but I am your worst nightmare, losers. Now, okay, that's social media talk. We get that sort of stupid rhetoric on social media all the time, particularly Twitter. But it's a little different when you're a man who owns a major polling company. How can you take anything that comes out of Ecos now seriously at all when you hear the owner of it put out unhinged crap like that? How can you not believe that his research, I mean, he's saying he's coming for you. This is a man who's unhinged. This is a man I could see the potential of just at least modeling, massaging, or rigging numbers to look more poorly for the people he doesn't like than the ones he does. The two people he referenced, by the way, Jenny Byrne and Jeff Ballingall, are both political organizers, operatives, whatever you'd call them, and I'm pretty sure they're tied in with the Poilievre campaign. That's why he was all wound up with them. I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is the atmosphere that's being built over this, and I don't like seeing it. I really don't. Mainstream media, and we're seeing, reporters, they're talking, they're already calling Polyev, a white supremacist. We're not seeing that out of the mainstream. We're seeing the social media actors doing that, but we're seeing ugly memes. There are mainstream media commenting that there sure are a lot of white people going to those rallies. Well, yeah, there's a lot of people who aren't. Why do they have to go straight to that narrative? Why? And, we're going to have, they're building another Clinton-Trump type election. And that's what they're making the comparisons to with Polyev as well. He's Trump-like. He's not at all. I mean, his policies are there. He's been in office 18 years. If he was extreme and crazy and going to do something out of bounds, he was in government for a while. He would have done it then. Cut it out, you guys. But what it is dividing Canadians. It's building that hate. It's building that atmosphere like we've seen in the States where families are actually divided. They can't get together because one person in the family was an open Trump supporter and one was an open Clinton supporter, and they still never got over it because we had this sick atmosphere of social media and conventional media feeding this hysteric division between each other on this sort of thing. And it's wrong, and it's just not good. And they're working on this. They're consciously doing that sort of crap. So that language out of Graves isn't that shocking when you see that agenda of making it that heated. I don't know if it was purposeful agenda. Maybe he's just got caught up in that race to try and polarize Canadians, but it was unbecoming to say the least. And again, as I said, it's not just some ass clown on Twitter with an anonymous account throwing that crap out there. They're a dime a dozen. This is the man who owns ECOS. So anytime you see an ECOS poll, just remember the man who's behind that, who calls people racist dickheads and Nazis and losers and says he's going to come out for them and that he's their worst nightmare. So I would say there's no polling worth a crap coming out of that man's company ever again. Also lets you know how reliable some of those pollsters are in general. I mean, everybody's got their own personal biases, but if you're a professional, you try to set some aside if you're in a business like that. And that was just ugly. And this is years out from a general election. We don't even know if Polyev is going to win the leadership race. He's just really lighting the world on fire right now. But presuming he does, look at the atmosphere they're building. Think of 2 more years, 3 more years before the general election, what they will have built by the time he actually gets out there and runs on the ground. It's pretty scary. All right, that's enough out of me for today. Kicking off the Monday. It has been a long weekend. Tomorrow I'm going to have, as I said, AJ Galante is going to come on and we're going to talk about the ice wars. Not everybody's cup of tea, but still it's interesting, and they're kicking it off in Edmonton. It's an Albertan thing. That's why I'm interested as well. It's not just a foreign thing going on. And I want to ask him, why did you pick Edmonton of all places? You're in Connecticut. As well, I'm going to have Shane Wenzel, though, and he's going to come on. He's a Calgary home builder. He's been on the show before. He's written columns for us, and Shane always lends a really good local business perspective, on things like that, home building, inflation, stuff like that, because those are big pressing issues with us. So as well, let's see, Danielle's going to be on Wednesday morning. So tomorrow you're stuck with just me for the show, but it will be a good one tomorrow. So come on back, guys, at 11:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, Mountain Standard Time, and we will do this all again with some new subjects and new guests. Thanks for tuning in.